It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. John Perk. After graduating from dental school at UMKC, John served as a dentist on an Indian reservation and in a neighborhood health center in Kansas City. 5 years later, he opened his own office and also joined the faculty in the Department of Restorative Dentistry at UMKC. He retired as professor emeritus after teaching and doing research for 35 years. He has an interdisciplinary PhD in oral biology engineering and did research on the bonding resin composite to gingival wall with Class II restorations. After being at Creighton for 5 years, he presently serves as chair of the Department of Oral Health Promotion. 8 years ago, he was ordained as a deacon for the Diocese KCMO and was the Catholic voice for live call-in Sunday radio program with a minister and rabbi for 10 years. He has his own program on Catholic radio in Kansas City on spiritual life. He is now an alum of Creighton, having graduated last May with a master's in Christian spirituality. Today he's going to share with us how caring for the person in the Ignatian tradition can be practiced by dentists. So I'd like you to have you join me in welcoming Dr. Perk.
Thank you, Dr. Wallen. Well, I feel like I am here today defending my master's thesis. I got my start in spirituality working on poor people. When I worked in poor clinics, I noticed that many were happier than I was. Even though I had more material and intellectual wealth than they did, they had more spiritual wealth than I had. I had gone to public universities my whole life, and I never had a class in theology or spirituality. So after I graduated from dental school, I had a pent-up demand for something more. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the Magus. I fulfilled all my dreams and visions, I thought, and I had reached them. But I wanted more. When I read the life of St. Ignatius, I could identify with him, and here was someone who thought he knew what he was doing, but he didn't, and he was open to searching for the more. I hope to give you the more this morning. I know it's a seminar on implants, so I thought, well, golly, what kind of implant can I talk about? I don't place them, I restored them in my office, but I got the most joy out of doing pre-implant provisional restorations. Because the burden of oral disease is on the poor. And there's over 108 million children and adults who don't have insurance. I was a Medicaid provider my whole time. I was on the Missouri Medicaid board. And there's 2.5 times more people without dental insurance than medical insurance. And if you want to know where health disparities are, just look up zip codes. After Pope Francis was elected, his friend, Brazilian Cardinal Claudio Hume, said, "Don't forget about the poor." Besides a Jesuit as the Pope, there are 28 Jesuit universities in the United States, 189 universities in the world, over 800 Jesuit educational apostolates, and according to one study, there are about 15 institutes of women that were spawned from Ignatian Spirituality. There's approximately 15,000 Jesuits worldwide. It takes 8 to 13 years to become a Jesuit, and every Jesuit takes a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And Father Carlson told me that some even take the 4th vow, obedience to the Pope. I am not a Jesuit. I feel like I'm a Jesuit after being here for 5 years. I'm married with 7 children, and my vocation is marriage. But it's like going up a mountain. You can go up the north, east, south, or west slope, and you all go through the same trials. The goal at the top of the mountain is union with God. I just get there with a different terrain than the Jesuits get there. And so why do they take these vows? Well, because we all need a victory over the 3 lusts of the world that the Apostle John talked about. And they take the vow of obedience to give them the victory over the pride of life. The vow of poverty for a victory over the lust of the eyes, materialism. And they take the vow of chastity to be victorious over the lust of the flesh. When they live in those vows, these are counsels that help them live the way God lives. Because the Most Holy Trinity lives in their divine communion of persons, with a mutual obedience or submission. The Son's under the mission of the Father's under the mission of the Son, the Holy Spirit is under the mission of the Father and the Son. And so there's a mutual obedience. There's also, before anything was created physically, the Trinity existed, so they have no need of material possessions. And of course, they're perfectly pure and holy in their relationships. The Jesuits have a 10-year universal plan, or what's called apostolic preferences. The first is to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment, and especially the daily examen. The second is to walk with the poor and the outcasts of the world. The third is to accompany young people, and a dental school is a great place to accompany young people. They bring a whole lot of enthusiasm, and they actually renew me in my work because they look at it from a different way. And to collaborate in the care of our common home. Now, I'm going to try and concentrate on the first two. In our department called the Oral Health Promotion, Department of Oral Health Promotion, we apply these Jesuits' charisms. And if you find yourself being able to support these charisms, I encourage you to keep an eye out for any faculty positions. This is a great place to work. When the accreditors came here, they couldn't believe, now this is compared to all dental schools in the country, they couldn't believe how well we all got along together. Faculty, staff, students, administration, and faculty. They couldn't believe it. I found that myself too, having worked in another university. And so here, not only do we train them how to use their hands, but we also train them how to use their heart. We have over 40 outreach experiences for our students, and most of those are in the zip codes that don't have access to care. Well, how did the world get the spiritual exercises and the rules for discernment? Well, if you went here, you probably know the story. But I sent a son to Rockhurst, a Jesuit university. I asked him if he knew the story, and he says no. I asked him if he ever did the spiritual exercises. He said no. I asked him if he knew the rules of discernment. He said no. And so I said, well, if I have anything to do about that, people are going to know. So 500 years ago, St. Ignatius was wounded by a cannonball while in a battle. And when he was convalescing, there was no books in the house except two books, Imitation of Christ and The Lives of the Saints. So he started reading them, and all of a sudden he became aware of the consolations and desolations he had. He noticed that the consolations lasted longer and were more intense and gave him a great sense of peace compared to when he read the lives of military leaders and romance novels, because I hear he was quite a ladies' man. These observations were the basis for his rules of discernment and for the spiritual exercises. So today I hope to show you that what the dentist does to the mouth and the patient, God does to the soul. My observation is that God perfects us similar to the way that we bring mouths to a level of health and perfection in our patients. But I have to start with some definitions. Because we're speaking, you start with a definition in anatomy, histology. There's a language. There's a language in spiritual theology. There's a science to it. It's called the science of ascetical and mystical theology. And I've been learning that language for about 40 years. So there's an active purification. That's what the patient or the soul does to perfect or purify their mouth or soul. And that's called asceticism. So the patient brushes, flosses, controls their diet, they do something, and the soul prays, fasts, gives alms, and keeps the commandments. And then there's a passive purification. That's what the dentist does to the patient to heal the mouth, or what God does to the soul to heal us. So the patient or the soul is actively receptive, and something is done to the patient or soul by someone outside of themselves. In the spiritual life, this is called mysticism, or experiencing God. You know, it's a mystical experience when a patient experiences the dentist. And so the dentist removes caries or calculus and cleans the mouth, and the patient experiences in the trial, in their suffering, the work of the dentist. Well, when God removes our sins, faults, and cleans the soul, we experience the work of God in us. He especially reveals himself when we're suffering from trials, tribulations, and when we lack peace, because nobody else comes to our aid. It's similar to sailing across a lake. You are active when you row, but when the wind blows, you're passive, but you're still making progress across the lake. Another basic principle is that no creature or created thing is capable of making us totally happy, because we have a soul, and only God can fulfill that soul. This is why it's called the spiritual life. St. Augustine expressed it very well. He said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." You see, God made the world for us, but us he made for himself. And if we knew how much we are loved, we would die of joy. So I'm starting with the premise that Jesus is who he said he is. He's God, he's the Lord, he's I am. I can't get anyone there. It's a gift. So is the mystery of the Holy Trinity. It is revealed. That's why it's called revelation. And if he rose from the dead and revealed himself to his followers, then he is still doing this today in 2022, right here in Omaha. And he revealed himself to Ignatius, and that's why the Jesuits are called the companions of Jesus. He revealed himself in the cave at Manresa in Spain. And if you go over to the Heider School of Business, you'll see a replica of that cave, and it's called the St. Peter Faber Chapel. Peter Faber was the first of Ignatius's companions to be ordained a priest, and he was a master of the spiritual exercises. His spiritual director was none other than St. Ignatius himself, and Faber had a habit of being too hard on himself, and Ignatius helped him to moderate that. So if you're serious about the spiritual life, you need a director. Patients who are serious about dental health need a dentist. I've had one for 44 years. If you can't find one, start with any good books on the spiritual life. And the spiritual life is not just about information, but it's about formation. It's about a personal living encounter. My John of the Cross book is 45 years old. He was taught by the Jesuits in the humanities. Most of his writings are online. And if you need a director and ask for one, God in his providence will send you one. He sent me one. When I started reading this book, I met a monk who had been at the Abbey at Gethsemane with Thomas Merton. He knew John of the Cross. We would meet together at night. We would read it, and I would say, "Yaroslav, what's happening in this book is happening to me." And so he moderated it at me. He said, "Remember, via media, the middle road, via media." Because I would have a tendency to go way off this way or that way, and he would say, "Via media, come back to the center." God also revealed himself to Pope Francis. Pope Francis was pastoring a church, and he felt the things you feel inside, he says. You don't know what they are, but his heart was burning. And so he felt like he was grabbed from the inside into the confessional, and in the confessional he had a profound experience with Jesus' mercy. So God revealed himself to Francis. As a newly consecrated layperson, Ignatius in 1522, without a formal education and any education in theology, but he did have a conversion from reading the Lives of the Saints. He had 5 mystical experiences or intellectual illuminations that changed his life forever. In these experiences, he had the confidence that God was real. and that he wanted to teach Ignatius about himself, as a teacher teaches a student, and that's where we get that philosophy of we're being taught in the Ignatius pedagogical style. So, this is the first of his mystical encounter. Now, this is all as a layperson without any, he didn't even have a college education or a theology degree. One day, while saying his office of Our Lady, his understanding began to be elevated that he saw the Most Holy Trinity in the form of 3 musical keys. That morning, he could not hold back his tears until dinner time, nor after eating could he stop talking about the Most Holy Trinity. He was like one of those stones when Jesus came in on Palm Sunday, and the authorities told him to tell the people to be silent. And he said to them, if they are silent, these very stones will shout out. 42 years ago, when I was on a retreat, I had an encounter praying the rosary. I have not been able to stop talking about it. I know you all talk about Nebraska football and Creighton basketball, but eventually you stop talking about it. The second mystical encounter he had was the manner in which God created the world. This gave him a great spiritual joy. The third was one day at Mass, at the elevation of the body of the Lord, he saw clearly how Jesus was there in the Most Holy Sacrament. It was the same encounter that the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus had, when Jesus explained everything to them, and then they sat down, broke bread, Jesus disappeared, and he went into the bread. He was present in the bread. The fourth one was that often for a long time he saw with interior eyes the humanity of Jesus. This is really important because if Jesus is just a divine person out here, an abstract idea or thought, and if he's not human, it doesn't hit you. So he thought to himself, if there were no scriptures to teach this, he would be solely resolved to die for it because of what he had seen. The fifth one was that while he was seated at the river Cardener, the eyes of his understanding began to be opened. This is what in the spiritual life is called infused contemplation, or what's called in the spiritual exercises, it's a consolation without a cause. His understanding was so enlightened that he felt as if he were another man, that he was another man with another mind. And he does not think that he had got as much from that encounter than from anything else in his life. Then he had a second encounter with the Holy Trinity. As a priest, he was on his way to Rome. He was looking for approval for his order. And he had a mystical encounter with the Holy Trinity at a city called La Storta. In a vision, God the Father was placing him with Christ his Son. And they told Ignatius, I want you to serve us. In the vision, God the Father said to him, and I will be favorable to you in Rome. And almost at once, the sacred name of Jesus was so imprinted in his soul that he wanted his congregation to be called the Society of Jesus. And if you note on our window on the 3rd floor on the east side of the building, IHS is a Christogram. It comes from the 3rd century. It was the way they wrote the word Jesus Christ. The first 3 letters of his name are in Greek, and the Greek letter sigma is written in the Latin alphabet as an S, and that's how you get the monogram written as IHS. In 1541, Ignatius adopted the monogram to represent his newly founded order, the Society of Jesus. In the blue circle, it reads in Latin, which I can't do, but it says the seal of the Society of Jesus. One of the charisms of Jesuits is actually not so much to form religious people, but is to form leaders in every field, including dentistry. And I highly recommend this book. When I came here, we had a faculty book club. I read it, and it compares 100 companies 100 years ago who had leadership practices, and then it compares that to the Jesuits, who is a company is 450 years ago. Only 10 of those companies still exist today, but the Jesuits are flourishing all over the world. And so he identifies the gifts of leadership. One of the principles is that he always wanted to help people who came to them to identify and use their gifts. He affirmed them. And as dentists and hygienists, you have gifts. The major gift you have is the gift of healing. Now, nationally, foundations know there's something different about a Jesuit education. So Creighton was chosen from among one of 13 universities in the United States by the Carnegie Foundation to study this leadership. Another principle is that there's two paths, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was one of the most illuminating principles that I had in spiritual direction 44 years ago. Because I'd go to spiritual direction and I'd tell them what I was thinking or what was going on during the day. And you know how I was trained to do it right, and I'm in these clinics and they're doing it wrong, and how I'm the good guy and they're the enemy and they're getting in my way. And he said to me, Johnny, you're eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You need to eat from the tree of life. I said, what? What are you talking about? He says, well, he explained to me, when you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you decide for yourselves what is good or evil, right or wrong. And if you notice in that garden, the fruit of that tree is domination. The strong dominate the weak, and the weak manipulate and control others. So there's a struggle, a battle going on, when we should be working in complementary ways with one another and sharing our gifts. And so we see others as a problem or an obstacle to our goals. Isn't this what's happening in Ukraine right now? It leads to authoritarianism, where the strong rule by force, by sheer will. Because we make idols out of others and things, and they disappoint us. Pope Benedict called that the dictatorship of relativism. The tree of life is where we follow a law outside of ourselves. Do you all know what the perfect language is? Anybody? Math. Math is a perfect language. 1 + 1 is 2 here, in China, in Indonesia, in South America. And so, why is that? Because it's an objective law outside of ourselves. If I think 1 + 1 is 7, when I go to the bank, I'm going to be entirely disappointed. And so there's an objective law outside of ourselves, which God defines. He defines what is true, beautiful, and good. And from this tree, we control ourselves. All of us have a desire for control. We will either control ourselves or we're going to control others. Sometimes people say, John, you got it under control? And I say, just myself. That's all that I can control is me. And then it helps you see others as a gift, not a problem or an idol to fix or control. And then in this tree, we're victorious from the three lusts. And when we become victorious, now we're free to always choose the good. And a great peace and joy is its fruit, rather than manipulation and domination. And so God wants to reveal himself to us, just like the patient has an encounter with the dentist. In the spiritual life, God wants to reveal himself. It's not just information, but as he truly is. And he says it in John. He says, whoever observes my commandments is the one who loves me. And whoever loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and reveal myself to him. If you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. And when you pray, fast, and give alms, do it in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will repay you. He will reveal himself to you. I read that and I go, if God is real and if he's true, and if I do what he says, he's going to reveal himself to me. And he did. So there's 5 dimensions to health. And the spiritual is what I'm going to concentrate on today. Well, the goal in the spiritual life is to participate in the divine nature. Grace builds on nature. The human virtues are rooted in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And those theological virtues adapt our faculties. I had no idea what the anatomy of the soul was. But I read John of the Cross, and he described them as memory, understanding, and will. That's how we participate in the divine nature, through those faculties. And because the theological virtues relate directly to God, those are given to us by him so that we know him. And in our chapel just down here, on the wall, those powers or faculties of the soul are carved into the chapel just down the hall. Ignatius said, "Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have, I call my own." It comes from his prayer, the Susapi prayer. Susapi means receive. So it's take, Lord, and receive. Receive my faculties. I give them to you, and you fill them with your grace. Well, what grace? Give me what kind of grace? The grace of faith, hope, and love. So faith purifies the understanding or the intellect. Another word for faith is truth. And we all have this experience. We say, it's true, isn't it true? It's like what metal is to a magnet, truth is to the intellect. We know it interiorly. Nobody has to convince us of it. It's true. Hope purifies the memory. Another word for hope is trust, mercy, or beauty. And love purifies the will. Another word for that is a fullness of goodness. And so we got faith, hope, and love, and truth, beauty, and goodness. That's what we were created for. That's what we long to contemplate. Why faith, hope, and love? Because if we saw God face to face, like Moses on the top of the mountain, Moses couldn't even see him face to face. God hid him in the cleft of the rock when he passed him. His beauty was so great that when Moses came down from the mountain, they had to put a veil over his face. He was so full of joy. And so if we saw God face to face, we would die in our bodies. I always liken it to, when my body woke up as an adolescent and I was in the presence of the most beautiful girl in the 7th grade, and I froze. I was in the presence of beauty. And God, what do they call God? The beatific vision, the beautiful vision. When you stand in his presence, you can't do it in a body. So these are the virtues that also keep persons together in a relationship. Because as long as you believe, trust, and serve one another, you have a healthy relationship. If one of those are lacking, there's a break in the relationship. There's a wound. And it's also what we strive for in our professional relationships. I always wanted my patients to believe me, trust me, and love me. And love me meant paying the bill. Because if they believed me, trusted me, and loved me, even if they went to those PPOs, I know they're going to come back. Because I was serving them in a disinterested way. I wasn't looking at their wallet. And if they believe me, they'll follow my advice. If they trust me, they'll let me work on them. And if they love me, they'll send me referrals. They'll tell others about their encounter or experience with me. And so the anatomy of the soul, before the fall, the first parents, Adam and Eve, were in union with God through faith, hope, and love. After the fall, the intellect became darkened. It became filled with error and ignorance. The memory turned into guilt, and the will became weakened. And that's why they covered themselves with fig leaves, because they saw each other as objects rather than as persons. I already explained the role of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But one of the greatest crises in the world today is broken relationships. In your own lives, how many relationships do you have that are very healthy and very broken? Well, fortunately, we've been given a remedy for broken relationships. In the garden, there was 3 breaks. There was a break with God, there was a break in relationship with others, and there was a break between the body and the soul. The body and soul don't work together. The body wars against the soul. And so, prayer. That's why Jesus says, pray, fast, give alms. Prayer heals that break with God through meditation and contemplation. Meditation in the Ignatian tradition is where you like to do mental prayer. It's like studying for anatomy or physiology. You think about it, you ponder it. Contemplation is similar to meditation, except you put yourself into the scene. Now, other spiritualities will talk about contemplation, where God reveals the knowledge to the soul. He infuses it directly into the intellect and the heart, just like he did with Ignatius. Almsgiving. When you give alms, you know, when I'm out there on the street and the beggars are on the street, I always go to McDonald's and I get myself a $5 gift cards. And when I come up to them, I give them a card. I don't give them money because I lived in the inner city for 10 years and people came to my house and they were always asking for stuff. And when I got them stuff, they were sad. They were really looking for money. So, and with that, they were doing things that I wouldn't give my own kids money for. So I always give them a McDonald's gift card. And when I do that, I always ask them, what is your name? And so I don't know this person, but now there's a connection. A relationship has been formed. It's been healed. And when I give alms, I notice that I don't put my trust so much in what I own, but in how many friends I have. And fasting heals the break between the body and the soul. Many years ago, I read this book, The Three Ways. Its author, I didn't know who this guy was. It was Father Garrigula-Garange. I found out later he was a master of the spiritual life at the Angelicum in Rome, down the street from the Jesuit seminary. And he was the dissertation director of St. John Paul II, who had a PhD in theology and philosophy. Somebody gave it to me, and I read it. When I read it, I said, I don't understand it, but I read it 13 times with a dictionary until I understood it. And what it is, it's a main treatise on the principles of ascetical and mystical theology. It's that soul anatomy, like dental anatomy, that you got to develop a language for so that you can make some progress. The book shows how Jesus formed and taught the apostles, and it's the same pattern that he reproduces in us. It has two titles, that's why I got two pictures up there. This history of the three ways goes back to the Apostle John in the first century in his first letter. He says, I'm writing to you children, young men, fathers. And that's where he refers to that threefold lust that becomes an obstacle to us. Origen in the 3rd century said the stages that John talked about are not literal, but they're spiritual stages. Children, adolescents, adults, beginners, proficient and perfect, physical and emotional growth. And then Pseudo-Dionysius in the 6th century, St. Bernard and St. Thomas and Ignatius. Ignatius refers to them in his exercises, the purgative and the illuminative in the first and second week. And his close friend, Nadal, the founder of the first Jesuit college, affirmed that in the exercises are those three ways. Here's an outline of the spiritual exercises, and I hope you're not taking notes because you won't be able to keep up. But there's a PDF that's uploaded that has all this information in it, where it describes what happens in the spiritual exercises. I was fortunate in my program. I was required to take an 8-day silent retreat. It's very difficult to be silent for 8 days. So the purpose of the spiritual exercises is to conquer oneself and regulate one's life without being determined through any tendency that is disordered. The goal is to choose a vocational state, or if you have one, to continue to grow in it. Because there's many goods out there, but which good is the greatest good for you? The Jesuits also have this practice of the daily examen, where they do reflection. They ask questions. What am I thankful for today? What kind of relationship did I have or interaction did I have with that patient or that person? Was I slow to speak? Did I think twice and speak once? Did I use my filter? Did I listen attentively? Did I allow the conversation the time it needs? This makes you the best version of yourself. And then Ignatius gives us how to make decisions in the 14 rules for discernment. Should I be a general dentist or a specialist? Should I marry? Who should I marry? I did this. I had a discernment for a vocation, and with a spiritual director, we determined, and God revealed to me that I should get married, and I should live marriage as an icon of the Holy Trinity. So the three ways of the spiritual life is a scaffolding for so many principles. In the purgative, it's what you should not do. In illuminative, it's what you do. If you're Catholic, you go to Mass. There's a confiteor where you purge yourself of sin. There's readings where you get illuminated, and there's communion. It's the same with, there's a process of growing and loving God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind. There's friendship, engagement, marriage. There's different stages there. And there's dental. There's disease control, restoration, maintenance. There's stages of religious life, novice, postulant, perpetual vows. And stages of learning. You acquire knowledge. You understand it. Then you become wise. And so, for example, if you look at a treatment plan, what do? There's disease control. There's restore. Then there's union with health. In the spiritual life, the first way is called the purgative, where sin is controlled. In that stage, God wins over the sensibilities like he won over the sensibilities of the Israelites who were in Egypt. He couldn't get them out of Egypt unless he did miracle signs and wonders. He won over their sensibilities, and then when he got them into the desert, he withdrew, and then he wanted to win over their intellect. And so there's a restoration, and then in the promised land, he unites himself. So this is in more detail, it's in your notes. I won't go over it because I'll go over my time, but there's more detail there. There's also crises and transitions between the stages. And it's important that a director helps you identify those. And so there's a crisis between the first and the second way, between the second and the third. It's like puberty between childhood and adolescence, and there's a transition between adolescence and adulthood. And then in a prayer life, if you suffer from dryness from meditation, it's usually a sign that God wants to reveal himself to you directly, and then from the contemplation to transforming union. And so in order to get to anything of perfection, it always passes by the way of self-denial. There's no holiness without renunciation. There's no health without renunciation of sweets and without a strengthening of the will. So Ignatian values are used to care for the poor. You know, implants are great, but because of health disparities, other provisional treatments are necessary. I had to care for people and apply scientific evidence. A friend came to me. She has an impacted number 11. It was resorbed. Number 10 was resorbed. She was in pain. The deciduous tooth had to come out. And I was left with number 10 with hardly any root. So that meant like a 4 or 5 unit bridge with a veneer. And she didn't have the money to do that. And so I made a matrix from a study model. I cut out the facial. I applied it. I cleaned the teeth. I acid etched as much as I could. I put the matrix in so on the lingual the resin wouldn't slump. I built it up in increments to reduce polymerization, shrinkage, and stress. Built it up in more increments. Finished it. And 3 months later it broke. And I was still looking at that 5 unit bridge of veneer that she didn't have money for. And so I learned from that experience, don't use microfill because its flexural strength is 50% of a hybrid. So I never used that before. So in April, I did a second one. And I had to bevel the enamel because I had to cut off all the old. But up until that time, really, I was not beveling the enamel. I was not removing it. This is a 22 years post-op, and she went to eternal life with this in place for 31 years on a canine. My next one was a 20-year-old male. He came into the dental school. He didn't want to wear a flipper. And so we did the same thing, took study models, applied it. I still didn't ground the enamel. I used a hybrid now instead. It was placed in increments, finished, the final product. I could never get the patient back. I was going to do a study and get the patient back so I could publish this. He was in the military, and he told me over the phone that he bit on a hoagie, and one of the abutments broke. And so I thought, well, that's not a failure. That tells me that this thing can stay in the mouth cantilevered. So maybe only cantilevering is necessary. So then I thought, well, I'm going to apply this principle on this diastemic closure. What do you think of the results? You like it? Well, that's the diastema I started with. And then a patient came in the emergency chair one day, and she was a female pipe fitter. She pulled on a wrench. She fractured number 7. It had to be extracted. She left 2 hours later with one of these composite ponics in place. You know, up until this time, we were just putting denture teeth in there, but the failure was at the interface of the denture tooth and the composite because you had to rely on mechanical retention. And the mechanical retention was the weak point. And so I thought, let's get rid of the denture tooth and let's just build it all up out of the same material. So this patient came in, age 19. She was wearing a flipper. And she had lingual caries damage. The palate was inflamed. So it was taking too long. So I took the ponics. I fabricated them on casts. I transferred them to the mouth to save time. I lightly polished underneath because a periodontist told me, what are you doing about the irritation of the material to the ridge? And I said, well, I don't know. So I polished it, I glazed it, and then I transferred it, I tack welded it, and that was the result. 5.5 years later, she came back with a fracture of the solder joint. I had bonded into both teeth. And not only that, but she came back on the side where I had to remove caries, and so there was kind of a built-in class 3 with that. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to redo this thing. I'm just going to finish it and polish it and see how long it lasts. So it lasted, both of them lasted 10 years, but the cantilevered one was still in place 4.5 years later. Then she went to private practice and had orthodontics for implants. After the orthodontics was done, they didn't have enough room for the implants, and she was told she needs a 3-unit bridge. She didn't want a 3-unit bridge, and the dentist thought it was crazy that I had done this. So she came back to me and said, will you fix it? So I did. I just ground the ponics with a diamond burr, etched it, and the bond strength is approximately 25 megapascals of new to old composite. And so I did it. So both of them are now cantilever bonded to the mesial of both cuspids, and they've been in place since 98, but the last picture I have is 19 years later in 2017. I was practicing with a guy. He did the same thing. And then this is one I didn't want to get into because the lady needed a denture. And pockets on number 9 were so deep. And so I had to extract it. And, you know, nobody's going to let you out. They're not going to let you leave their office without a front tooth. And so I'm just going to bond this thing to there, and we'll figure it out later. And so that's what we did. But the patient then returned and wanted the diastema closed. And I said, well, it's going to look stupid. She didn't care. She wanted the diastema closed, so I closed it. Then 4.5 years later, tooth number 8 had to be extracted. Because there was a 12-millimeter pocket, I tried to talk her into a denture. She didn't want a denture. And so, but number 9 was still bonded 4.5 years later to 10, just cantilevered. And so I took care of number 8, transferred it, bonded it in place. Both centrals are cantilevered only. 8 and 9 are not bonded together. It's been there 14.5 years. It will not debond. Number 8 did debond, and so I had to attach it with a class 3 prep. Okay, so why does this work? I have an interdisciplinary in engineering, and so I said I'm going to calculate why this works. That's not an exact calculation, but it's better than no calculation. So let's first figure out the area. I measured the area of the resin solder joint at the interproximal surface. I calculated then the area of each resin solder joint for one abutment and for 2 abutments. Then I needed to know the force. So I went to the literature and I found out what maximum biting forces were. Of course, they gave them to me in pounds, and so I had to calculate kilograms, and from that I had to calculate newtons, because megapascals is newtons over millimeter squared. And so maximum biting forces are very, very high, but maximum chewing forces are much lower. at Ramford said 95% of the time, the forces do not exceed 9.8 newtons. And so I took the force over the area for one abutment, I calculated with maximum chewing forces, about 10 megapascals. 95% of the time, it's only 1.5 megapascals. And so the bond to the enamel is approximately 25 megapascals, sometimes weaker, sometimes much stronger. But it's greater than the maximum biting low range. It's greater than the maximum chewing, and it's greater than 95% of the time of chewing forces. Remember, this is bonding to one abutment. But you don't want to do any of these on heavy clenchers or grinders. So this is an adaptive standard of care, but it could be the standard if more dentists did this. These are provisional restorations. You keep the occlusion off the ponic. You want to increase the surface area with beveling. Grinding the enamel will increase it by 18% the bond. And you're also removing a fluoride-rich layer so that you'll get a better bond when you bevel. You want to do an incremental placement, and I like cantilevered ponics. You want your ponic height to be 5.5 millimeters. This is just a reminder that when people come to me, I'm caring for them. They're created in the image and likeness of God. They also have the power to think and choose what's best for them, and so I have to respect their autonomy. Now back to the spiritual life. There's two parts to the soul, the sensual and the spiritual. The sensual relates to the outer world, and the spiritual relates to the inner world. Well, in the morning, y'all will never forget this. In the morning, if you go east to work, what do you see? You hit the sun. When you hit the sun, it illumines your window. If your window's dirty, you can't see. Now, if you turn around and go west, you can see, but you're going the wrong way. That's the same window, but not illuminated by the sun. So in order to see, I need to clean the windshield. This happened to Peter. He caught all the fish. The light of Christ illuminated his soul, and Peter said, "Oh Lord, depart from me, for I got a what? A dirty windshield?" No. He says, "For I'm a sinful man." But then how did Jesus, what was Jesus' response? Peter, be not afraid. And that's what patients come to us. We illuminate their mouth. It's a mess sometimes. And they're ashamed, and they confess, and I say, well, be not afraid. Can you trust me? I'm here to help you. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here to help you carry this trial. And then what did the woman do who was caught in adultery? They never talk about the man. Why? Because he went the other way. He didn't see what he had done. So her tears of repentance healed her. And so what do you do when you can't see? You hit the tear producer on the windshield button, and it cleans the window. The outside window is cleaner, but it isn't totally clean. It needs a purification or a cleaning by a power greater than the wipers. And so it needs the passive purifications, something outside of itself to clean it. And so after you clean the outside of the window, now you discover you still can't see because the inside is dirty. And that's the spiritual part of the soul. You have the sensory, which is to the world. The inside is to you. So there's a second purification of the window is needed. After that's done, you can clean. You can now see where you're going. Ignatius actually kind of talks about this in the first week of the spiritual exercises. Have anybody here ever made the spiritual exercises at a retreat center anywhere? One? Well, if you make those exercises, you will have, it's great. I took a whole class on it, and I had to do it, and I took another class on it. And so the fruit of that is just incredible. The first week, your experience is that you're a loved sinner. And then our patients need to know that we accept them and committed to them without judging them. And so I already told you that I say to them, be not afraid, I'm glad you're here. Because in the presence of God, His light reveals our self-knowledge. When I first got in the spiritual life, I thought, this is great. You know, all I'm going to do, I just want to be a good guy. I don't want any trouble. And I just want to follow what he says. And before you knew it, I found out I was in lots of trouble, And I found things about myself that were crushing. But the Lord always came and consoled me. He came and consoled me. And so he says, fear is useless. What is needed is trust. So I always tell the patients, I say, can you trust me? I won't do anything without your permission. God never does anything to us without our permission. He respects our freedom. He doesn't force himself on us. This is for the seniors. This is a video of the passive purification of the tooth from calculus. It's a video the periodontal department has. I extracted 4 third molars, but first I did scaling on them to test my ability. And then when I extracted them, I noticed it was bad. So I said, well, I'm going to clean these teeth and take a video. So I held the teeth in my hand with a scaler, a Cavitron. And it took me 59 strokes using a Cavitron on 1 third molar and 60 plus strokes using a Cavitron on another molar. It humbled me as a dentist. And Dr. Brown tells me, Laura Brown, Cherry Perio, she tells me that's exactly what it's like, you know. And then I also got a video of leaky dentin for bonding. I spent most of my life studying bonding to the gingival floor of a Class 2 restoration and how the composite bond down there is terrible, especially on enamel when the rods are in parallel. So it's about bonding. The spiritual life is about bonding. It's about bonding yourself to God. And the more you increase the surface area, the better chance you're going to have of being bonded to Him. Okay, thanks for listening. I landed the plane at exactly when they wanted me to. It was a joy to be here, and I feel like I passed my thesis defense. Thank you.